If you can't make the whole call, you can tune into it we'll put it up on YouTube as soon as we are off the call and can edit it probably tomorrow. But yeah, the major reminders are just on this screen. So feel free to ask questions. This is supposed to be kind of an informal recap and Q&A. And Haley, you can go to kind of the next slide here. Sweet. So just a couple pre-course reminders. So the gear list is on that email that was sent out. It's also the gear list you can also find on the hyperlink on your course registration ticket. You do not need to print out your course registration to bring it with you. That was actually just an error we made in the registration. We have your contact info and know who's there on any given day. So when you arrive at the Jim Bridger Lodge, you'll just check in with me and we'll get you assigned to a group. We're meeting at the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck at 9 a.m. And yeah, I put the smart waiver link in the chat. That's also in the emails and in the pre-course. So we just ask that you fill out that waiver ahead of time, or we'll have you fill it out day of. But it's a lot more comfortable to fill the waiver out in advance than when it's cold outside on the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck at 9 a.m. What to expect for the field days? The field days this weekend. We had some new snow this week, which is awesome. Bridger Bowl will be more crowded because of the new snow. So give yourself plenty of extra time. We want you to be there at 9 a.m. and like be ready to rock and roll and like join a group and start being a student. We'll be outside and moving for the whole day. We'll ride the Sunnyside lift, then the Alpine lift out to Bradley's Meadow area. And in the morning, we'll go over forecasts, trip planning, talk about avalanche terrain, snowpack, and making observations. And then in the afternoon, we'll go over mostly avalanche rescue and travel practices. The way that the course is set up is there's not like a formal lunch break, and we don't go down to a lodge at any point during the day. So just plan to be outside all day. The weather forecast looks like fairly sunny, but a bit cold in the mornings, both Saturday and Sunday. So just kind of come prepared for that. We try to keep people moving and make sure people stay comfortable. Like we don't want learning to happen at, the cost of being really uncomfortable, but we just ask that people show up prepared. So I think that might have been all of the reminders. Yeah, does anyone have any questions that are specific to the field days before we get into the recap?
I have a question. If we don't have a Bridger pass, do we need to get a lift ticket?
Oh, that is a great question. No, we provide one ride tickets. I think that was in the pre-course info.
I think it was. I was just double checking.
You're good. So we provide one ride tickets for everyone. So if you have like a midweek pass or you don't have a pass, we got you covered for riding the lifts with us uphill for the start of the day. And then those passes come back to us after the course is over. And yeah, we'll plan to be done at 3 p.m., if not a little earlier. And we'll be back at the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck at the end of the day. And then the other question that just popped up in the chat is asking about leashes. And if you have skis that don't have brakes, you have to have leashes to load the lifts at Bridger. It's just part of their skier conduct code. So plan on having brakes or leashes. For some reason, they don't seem to really care about snowboards with that. So it's really mostly for people with ski bindings that don't have brakes. That's a great question. Cool. And yeah, if you have more questions, just feel free to reach out to the friends at gnfac@gmail.com and we can answer any of those questions. And I think Haley, I'll just toss it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Shannon. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Haley Darby, and I'm one of the educators with GNFAC. I also work as the intern for the Avalanche Center this season and work closely with Shannon as well. I won't be out there this weekend, but we'll have a group of great instructors that will be out in the field with you. So let's get started. Whether we have a bunch of videos on YouTube, hopefully that you had time to watch them. They go over all sorts of things: terrain, weather, snowpack, rescue, risk management, preparedness, and trip planning. But even by participating in this pre-course video call, you'll be well set up for the weekend. So let's get into it. So why do you need to know about avalanches? 90% of fatal avalanches are triggered by the victim or someone in the victim's party. And this statistic is really important because it means that a lot of the onus of avalanches can be on us. And that gives us a lot of power to choose whether or not we want to recreate in terrain that can even have avalanches and expose ourselves. How much hazard do we want to take on? How much exposure, how much time in the position we want to interact with that terrain, and how vulnerable we are to the impacts of an avalanche. So all of those three things combined are part of avalanche risk. Avalanches are a natural hazard present in snow-covered mountains, and really no matter what user group you are a part of, whether you're a motorized user, a snowboarder, an ice climber, even people that live in snowy environments like we do, I think it's really important that everyone has a great baseline understanding of avalanches. So that's kind of the foundation of why we're here and why we're learning about them. In the US, we average around 27 fatalities due to avalanches annually. And these are equal opportunity killers. In the avalanche rescue and gear videos, we break down these statistics more in hopes of learning about past avalanches and how we can avoid making those same mistakes. So let's start this course with the foundation understanding of what an avalanche is and why it's dangerous. And let's go back to the main basics. What is an avalanche? So avalanches contain several different key ingredients. You need to have snow, you need to have a slope, and you need to have a trigger to get that snow to move. Triggers can be natural or they can be caused by humans or other snowmobiles. They can be caused by even animals. But avalanches also come in many different shapes and sizes. So you can have avalanches that are made of loose snow. They start at a point and they fan out. You can have avalanches that are made up of big blocky slabs. You can also have avalanches that contain a lot of water in them. They can be wet or they can be dry. And wet snow avalanches are typically associated with when liquid water enters the snowpack. That can happen at all times of the year, but typically that's more associated with springtime. And often, though wet avalanches can be very, very destructive, we typically don't see as many accidents involved with them because honestly, the travel conditions are so poor during that time of year that there's just fewer people out recreating in the mountains. The most deadly avalanches we see are these dry slab avalanches. So we'll talk a little bit more about those specifically. Let's see, I'm just going to check the chat real quick, make sure. Is everyone able to see the slides? I just got a message that, great. Okay, well, send me a message if you're unable to. I am sharing my screen right now, so just let me know if for some reason you can't. I'll try to keep the chat up so I can see messages. I'm on just one monitor right now, so I've got a lot of little screens, but I will try my best. And yes, please raise your hand or just speak out into the group if you can, and let me know. That'll be the most direct way to reach me. All right. So we've kind of talked about the basics. Avalanche is snow moving downhill. We can have wet avalanches. They can be dry, they can be loose, they can be flabby. And this is called the avalanche triangle. And it involves three key things with us as humans in the center. The avalanche triangle consists of the snowpack, the terrain, and weather. And then the trigger or human factors in the center. And we are really going to focus on terrain in this course that you're going to take, because honestly, terrain as well as the trigger are the only two things of these four things that are in our control. I can't change how the snowpack is going to be layered. I can't change how the weather is going to come in, but I can change where I'm at in terrain and if I'm choosing to step out into terrain that can involve avalanches. And then obviously human triggers are going to be involved in that as well. So this is a picture, I believe it was in Ella's video that you watched about avalanche terrain, but it is an awesome picture of an avalanche path that's very obvious to see. Avalanche paths are not always as obvious as this photo right here, but it's a great example. And often we think about avalanche paths as this steep start zone in green at the top, where it is as steep as it's going to be. And that's where we kind of think about where you might trigger an avalanche. But it's really important to understand that avalanches are not only where they begin, but also where they run and where they stop. So avalanche terrain is all three of those things, where avalanches start, run, and stop. And in this picture, it's really obvious to see. We can see that snow from previous avalanches has cleared out trees all in this track zone in yellow and all the way into this run out zone here in red. And we won't talk a ton about it in the course. It's a little bit above the scope of the course, but usually there's a 20-degree angle between run out zones and start zones. So that's how you can, if you want to understand whether or not you're in the run out zone of an avalanche path, you're able to shoot an angle. It's called an alpha angle. And if you're within 20 degrees, it's possible that you are still within an avalanche path. And the caveat to that is that wet snow avalanches act in unique ways too, as well as if there's terrain that can channel debris. So that can be unique considerations with avalanche paths. But the basic thing to come away from is that the start zone isn't the one thing that's involved in avalanche terrain. And it's really important to understand whether or not you're choosing to enter avalanche terrain that day and whether it looks like traveling through the run out of the path, traveling up the track, or if you want to avoid all of those things entirely. All right, so terrain basics, they involve a lot of different things. I think that the two most important of all of these are slope angle, because if we know our slope angles, we know how to stay out of avalanche terrain, as well as understanding consequences. And these are, the term for this is called terrain traps, and that's anything that can magnify the consequences of an avalanche. Other important things to know are how big is the slope, how much interconnected terrain is involved in the path. Is there clues within vegetation that can tell you that avalanches have run there previously? Are there little tiny trees? Are the trees all flagged in one direction with only branches on the downhill side? What aspect is it with the elevation, the slope shape? But the two key things are the angle and then the consequences. So when we're talking about slope angle, what exactly do we mean? Most avalanches occur within 30 to 45 degrees. And that is especially representative of those dry slab avalanches. It's this slope characteristic isn't saying that the avalanches don't happen on terrain that's steeper than 45 degrees, because they definitely do, but it's just less common. And that is because it's not as likely for weak layers to build up and layers of snow to build up, and they kind of self-slough. So Avalanches definitely happen in very steep terrain. It's just less common, and usually you won't have those big dry slab avalanches. And then with terrain that's less than 30 degrees, it's because you can still have weak layers. You can still have the setup for an avalanche. The problem is the snow is not able to gather enough momentum to actually slide downhill. So in terms of start zones, less than 30 degrees is very, very uncommon. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but terrain that is less than 30 degrees can be involved within an avalanche track or runout zone. So that's key to know. But in general, the key angles are 30 to 45 degrees, and 38 degrees is kind of like that key spot in particular where it's most likely to trigger an avalanche. And you can kind of think about that if you skied at a ski area before. Usually like a black diamond or a double black diamond is going to be that like 30 to 45 degree range. All right, so we kind of talked about this, how avalanche zones are where they start, run, and stop. But this gives us a better idea of what that can look like outside of like a really typical avalanche path like we saw in that last video. But in here, I really like this picture because it shows us our most likely starting zone, close to 39 degrees. That's really close to what I just mentioned. 38 is like that sweet spot. But it's super important that we understand that terrain that can be underneath, like these gentler trees to the side with start zones overhead, as well as connected terrain. And that's important to know, especially when you're dealing with a persistent weak layer where you have, which is typically involved with a dry slab avalanche, because if that weak layer is across the whole slope and you have connected terrain that also includes that weak layer and an avalanche starts in a starting zone, it's possible that it can spread all the way to that connected terrain. So understanding where you are in relation to avalanche paths is a really important skill that we will work more on in the course. All right, so the idea with terrain is to keep it simple. This slide has a lot of words on it. So, but the key things to understand is just that knowing how to identify avalanche terrain is really important so that we can make that independent choice of whether or not we want to enter that terrain. And understanding how much time are we actually spending in this terrain, especially in regards to where we're choosing to travel uphill, because we're spending many hours traveling uphill and versus maybe just a few minutes traveling downhill. And so think about how vulnerable you are for those hours if you're choosing to travel uphill in avalanche terrain. So it's important to minimize time spent in adjacent to or below avalanche paths, as well as choosing places with your group to regroup, to meet back up, to space out terrain. It's really important to utilize safe travel practices, which we'll talk more about as well. And I think really the goal with our course and with talking about terrain is to kind of provide you all some empowerment within understanding terrain, because when you're first getting into this sort of stuff in an area such as we live, it's really easy to see a skin track and want to hop on the escalator and go right up because it seems like, well, that's where someone else went before. So why is it not good for me to go? And hopefully you come away from this course being able to take a step back and think about that skin track or think about that ski line and think, does that actually fit into your goals for the day? Maybe it does, but maybe if your goal was to stay completely out of avalanche terrain that day, it totally doesn't. So that's kind of our purpose, our main purpose talking about terrain within this course is to empower you to make those decisions of whether or not you even want to be there. All right, before we move on, our next topic we'll go over is weather, but are there any specific questions about avalanche terrain that you all have? Feel free to put them in the chat or say them out loud. I'll do my best to answer them. And then if something comes to you later, you're always welcome to ask later on too. I'll give it a minute or less and see if anyone has questions. All right, doesn't look like it, so let's move on to weather. So weather is a key part within that recipe for an avalanche. We need mountain weather to create a layered snowpack. Without it, we might just have a homogeneous snowpack with no layers at all, and then avalanches would be much less of a problem. So weather creates our different layers that cause our avalanche problems. And really within weather, it's important to be able to understand red flags. So red flags within weather that we want to be keeping our eyes and ears attuned for when we're out in the mountains involve several different things. The first one is snowfall. So kind of simple. As we get more snow, avalanches are going to become more of a problem. And it's important to understand not only how much did it snow, how many inches just came in, but how much water is within that snow. A great example actually happened last night or yesterday, where Bridger Bowl got 16 inches of snow, but it was super light pixie dust snow, and it was only 1.5% water, which is extremely light. That's the cold smoke that you hear about. And that really is not adding a ton of weight to the snowpack. So that's going to be very different from some of those heavier storms that we got at the end of the year, like around New Year's, that were adding inches of water to the snowpack. So you'll see this term within the avalanche forecast. It's called SWE, or snow water equivalent. And that is basically, if you took all the snow that fell and melted it out, how much water would come out of that. Usually when we are concerned about avalanches within storm snow, they are most reactive within the storm and immediately after. So that avalanche problem settles out pretty quickly, but it's important to understand if you're out in the mountains and it is snowing snowing heavily in general, and especially way more than you thought it was going to snow or way more than it was forecasted, that's a red flag to be aware of and to maybe begin to think about changing your travel plan because of. This is another example of that SWE. So if we melted all that snow in this bucket here, SWE is all the water that it would contain. The next weather red flag is wind. And wind can do a lot of different things to the snowpack. You can have a bunch of snowfall, and with very little wind, you're going to reduce any wind avalanches that could occur until the wind starts to blow. And that happened this season as well. We got a ton of snowfall at the end of the year, but it was abnormally light winds for us. And then all of a sudden the wind started to blow and the avalanche danger rose. So what are some things, some surefire ways that you can look at the snow around you while you're out in the mountains and see if the wind has been present and how much it has changed the snow around you? So the first very obvious thing to look for is cornice formation. And cornices are basically all the wind is blowing the snow from the windward side, or where that's coming from. So, and then it's blowing it onto what's called the leeward side and building up these big blocks or like lips of snow onto ridge lines or specific terrain features. So for example, like in the Bridger Range, we have winds predominantly from the west. So when we have new snowfalls and winds are associated with it, those westerly winds will pick up that snow from the west side of the Bridgers and blow it onto the east side. And so we have cornices typically facing east. And that's one reason why Bridger Bowl is a great place to have a ski area, is because it gets loaded by all that snow that comes in. What are some other things to look for? This is called cross-loading. Cross-loading occurs when you have shifting winds throughout a cycle, and cross-loading can create surprising results and unexpected results that you wouldn't expect. And it's important to look for these like lips that are kind of opposing. That's a great sign that winds or specific terrain features have been cross-loaded by winds. Another thing to look out for is textured snow surfaces. So if you see these like ripples within the snowpack, or it's called sastrugi, but it's like wind forms these little features on the snow that are raised above it. Or often a really interesting phenomenon is you'll see skin tracks or even like animal tracks that are above the snow surface. And it's because the wind has sculpted around them and kind of raised those above the snow. So those are all really great signs that the wind has done a number on the snowpack beyond what you're feeling underneath your skis. Usually, if it's happening right underneath you, you'll be able to feel a stiff, hard slab of wind-packed snow underneath your skis, and it'll be apparent in the ski quality as well, that wind has been present on your snow. What are some other weather things that we need to be aware of? Temperature. So in the same vein of high snowfall makes avalanches happen, big wind changes make avalanches happen, big temperature changes. Weather, very cold, freezing temperatures, but in particular, very high temperatures really can make avalanche conditions more hazardous. When you add liquid water to the snowpack, it destabilizes snow incredibly quickly. And so when we talk about rapid warming, that can be if it's raining, which thankfully we don't have too often here, but that can also occur if the sun's out and it's shining, springtime. That can even happen if you have a big dump of snow midwinter, but then you have unseasonably warm temperatures. Then you will have all these wet snow temperature related avalanche problems. And in particular, extended periods of non-freezing temperatures create dangerous avalanche conditions. So usually when our snowpack is transitioning from a midwinter to a spring snowpack, we will have a few days of above freezing temperatures that destabilize the snowpack quickly and make it quite dangerous. And usually the avalanche danger will spike during that time before we transition to those to where it freezes at night and then warms up during the day, and we can maybe ski corn or something like that. So big temperature changes destabilize the snowpack, create avalanche problems. And you'll often see, I don't know if you've ever seen these little cinnamon rolls coming down from like road cuts or something like that. It's really easy to see them on a warm day in highlight because of those slopes can be so steep. Those are surefire signs that the snowpack is becoming rapidly unstable. So what are ways that we can check before we go out to see what's going on? Obviously, checking the weather before we go out, using whatever weather source you enjoy using. The National Weather Service is typically what I use, and you'll be able to talk with your instructor more about what they use and what they recommend. Also reading your local avalanche forecast, if there is one. They will always put in a little weather summary of what happened yesterday, what they expect to happen today, and what weather is kind of coming your way tomorrow. So taking all these things, then you go into the field. So you've done your homework before leaving the house. You go into the field and you're remembering these weather red flags. So heavy snowfall, strong winds, and then a rapid rise in temperature above freezing. And stay alert to changing conditions. If something's happening that you didn't expect, that's like a blaring light in my head. Like maybe, again, do I want to change my travel plan because it's getting way warmer than I thought, or it's way windier than I was expecting? Maybe it's time to rethink my original plan and see if it continues to make sense. All right, so we're going to move on to the snowpack component of the avalanche triangle. And before we do that, I want to make sure, does anyone have questions about weather? Snowpack and weather are pretty similar. So again, if something comes to you later, please ask me, but I'll give it a few moments to see if anyone has questions about weather before we move on. Okay, so let's talk about snowpack. So we can see, and we've talked about, the weather creates the snowpack, and we can see in this picture here that this snowpack is multi-layered. Weather and changes in snow crystals between storms produce the layered nature of the snowpack. And the relationships between these layers determine whether the snowpack is stable or unstable. And the relationships between these layers also help us determine the avalanche problem that we're dealing with, which in turn helps us make a safe travel plan and make decisions about whether or not we even want to enter avalanche terrain. So we already kind of talked about a recipe for a slab avalanche, but let's go over it quickly again. For slab avalanche, we need 3 or 4 components. We need the terrain, so terrain that is steeper than 30 degrees, between 30 and 45. We need a slope that is steep enough to slide. And then we need a slab. So that is just a hard, weak, or a hard, cohesive layer of snow that is then on top of a weak layer. And then we need a trigger. So triggers can come in all forms. We've talked about humans as triggers, but other triggers can also include a bunch of new snow, wind, and like if a cornice fails, that adds a ton of weight to the snowpack and is often a trigger for a natural avalanche. So observing and understanding the snowpack, whether or not that slab exists and whether or not it exists over a weak layer, it's very key in order to safely manage terrain and the snowpack and ourselves within it. For example, snowfall events that begin calm and cold and then become warm and windier come in, maybe you've heard this term before, but a storm can come in upside down. So you can even have weak layers within the same storm system. It doesn't have to be snow that's been sitting for a while that then gets capped with something. Though these weak layers can occur within a storm. And this can produce the same result of having a slab or like a denser layer of snow on top of cold, softer snow underneath. So that's all of the ingredients we need to have a slab avalanche. And layers will change over time. Thankfully, there's a reason why maybe we choose to ski certain terrain midwinter, early season, and the snow changes throughout the season. We get a lot more. And in the spring, we're able to ski potentially a lot more things. The snow is really dynamic and it is always changing in response to conditions. It can strengthen and then weaken. It can get weak and then gain strength over time. And these processes are super complex, but you can learn a lot more about them. And that's not really what this course is about at all, but just understanding that these layers change over time is really key. And so we're not just stuck with like the snowpack that we have. Sometimes layers hang out for a really, really long time. If any of you were out in the backcountry last season, we had some really weak layers that hung out basically all season long. So each season is different. Each snowpack is different. And in this course, we're going to take a very brief and simplified look at some of the processes that change in mountain snowpacks. But there's a lot more that can be learned if you decide to go further in your avalanche education. So snowpack layering determines snow stability. And I think I like this slide because it's just super simple. If we have a hard layer over a soft layer, that is the recipe for our slab avalanche. That's bad. If we have soft snow and then even softer snow underneath, that can also be part of that recipe for a slab avalanche. And then typically, if we have soft snow over hard snow, that's good. But then this says, watch out for spatial variability. And that basically means spatial variability is kind of sounds like a complex term, but it basically just means that the snowpack right underneath your feet doesn't mean that 100 feet to your right, it's exactly the same. So understanding that the snowpack varies and can vary dramatically from place to place across the slope. So the snowpack that exists at the bottom of an avalanche path could look quite a bit different than snowpack near a ridgeline in a start zone. So when we talk about avalanches, and this kind of relates to reading the avalanche forecast, but the recipe for an avalanche might look a little different in the snowpack depending on the nature of our avalanche problem. And avalanche problems are defined by avalanche problem type, the location of where you're most likely to find these avalanches, the size of the avalanche, as well as the likelihood of triggering the avalanche. And understanding this avalanche problem helps us interpret the avalanche forecast. And so this is an example of all the different potential avalanches that we can have. The main ones that we're most concerned with are the ones that are circled. Not all dry slab avalanches are the same. The ones that are circled are part of the dry slab criteria, but wind slabs and storm slabs are quite different problems than persistent slabs or deep persistent slabs are. So persistent slabs are associated with persistent weak layers that we kind of discussed earlier, and they may produce avalanches weeks or months after they are buried. So when we're traveling in the backcountry, we might use different strategies to stay safe. So if the avalanche problem for the day is a wind slab or a storm slab, those are potentially a lot more manageable than dealing with a persistent slab or a deep persistent slab. And as you start to read the forecast more, you will start to understand like some of the travel advice that becomes associated with those different avalanche problems and how you can avoid them, or maybe with a persistent slab or deep persistent slab, stay entirely out of avalanche terrain. So why is all this information important to us as backcountry travelers? As snow layers in the snowpack accumulate and change, different avalanche problems can form. So you can have the slab over weak layer recipe for an avalanche that can look different for very different avalanche problems. And our terrain management decisions vary between those days. This is kind of like what I was mentioning. My travel plan may look quite different when there's a wind slab problem versus when there's a deep persistent slab problem. So understanding the problem helps us mitigate risk and make safer decisions when we're in the backcountry. So as we're talking about the snowpack component of the avalanche triangle, as you can see in this photo, the mountain snowpack is layered, and that photo that I showed previously, the mountain snowpack is layered, and weather and changes in snow crystals between storms produce a layered nature of the snowpack. The relationships between these layers determine if the snowpack is stable or unstable, and then these relationships help us decide what or help us understand what avalanche problem we're dealing with, and then we can make our travel decisions from there. So understanding the snowpack, and then from that understanding, moving towards understanding avalanche problems and what we're dealing with is really key, and being able to make those terrain choices, which is like what I mentioned at the start of this, and is super important because we can decide whether or not we even want to be in avalanche terrain depending on the problem. So where do we fit risk into this equation? We can make choices to influence our exposure and our vulnerability. So we kind of mentioned that at the start. Now that we understand avalanche hazard, what an avalanche is, where to find it, what it is made up of, understanding our exposure, so the amount of time and position we're interacting with that terrain, and then how susceptible we are to the impacts of an avalanche is really key. And before we move on to this part of the presentation, I just wanted to open it up once again to questions about snowpack. If there's anything, I'll give it a few moments. Oh, I see one. Okay. Can I explain where to dig a pit? Yes. So in the course you're about to take, we will discuss, oh, and is it before you start and then midway? So avalanche snow pits, or snow pits in terms of finding out what your problem are useful for specific things. Sometimes when you're dealing with storm slab instabilities and wind slab instabilities, digging a pit can be helpful, but it's super key to understand all those other surface observations we can make while we're out there. Like I talked about, how wind can change the snowpack a lot, and digging a pit and doing a snowpack test can help you determine how reactive a storm slab can be as well. When we dig pits, we want them to be, number one is safe. So we do not need to dig pits in avalanche terrain. For a long time, it was thought that you needed to dig a pit in avalanche terrain, and that's been shown that that's not the case. So thankfully, we can reduce our exposure and vulnerability by not digging snow pits in avalanche terrain, which is great. You will get very similar results if you are digging in terrain less than 30 degrees. You also want pits to be representative. So if I have the goal of going out and skiing on a north-facing line that's avalanche terrain at a certain elevation, I'm going to get as close as it's safe, that is also north-facing in a similar elevation band to get the most representative information from that. And then we also want snow pits to be courteous. So not everywhere you go in the backcountry can be really busy, but often certain zones that recreationalists like to go in around here are very popular. And so making sure that you're not digging a snow pit that's going to create a big hole for someone to fall into, and making sure to fill it in is really important as well. And then in terms of like when to dig, it kind of falls into that representative piece. If I want to go ski a line that's at like 8,500 feet, then it doesn't make a ton of sense for me to dig a snow pit that's maybe at 5,000 feet where the trailhead is, but I might try to get closer to that elevation band that's representative to decide whether or not it makes sense for me to dig a pit. And then there's one more question. I may have missed this, but what have you seen the snowpack in the past couple of weeks? So we will talk about this over the weekend. We'll go over the avalanche forecast so that will give you like the brief rundown. But in general, our snowpack is, our avalanche danger is mostly focused on wind slab avalanches. We haven't had a ton of new snow outside of the Bridger Range, which, as I mentioned, had a ton of super low density snow. So there is a potential for storm slab avalanches to be the case, but because there's such little water in that snowpack, it's less of an issue. But wind slabs and winds moving all that new snow around is totally an issue. So in all of our zones across our advisory area, wind slab avalanches are of highest concern. And then in zones in the southern part of our advisory area, so the southern Madison, Gallatin, in Lionhead near West Yellowstone, and then in Cook City, more prominent persistent weak layers exist. And so we are still considering those as we think about our terrain choices. So, but that is less the case in our northern zones. We just have seen significantly less activity on those persistent weak layers near the bottom of our snowpack. So that's kind of a super brief rundown of what's been going on throughout the season. Very different season than last year. And if you have specific questions too, please bring those up with your instructor over the weekend. So thanks for all those great questions. Let's keep moving. Make sure I don't want this to go too late. So if it's all that easy, why are there still accidents? So when we ski and ride, we seek out terrain that's fun. And if you like to ski, and kind of like I mentioned, a black diamond or a double black diamond is pretty fun skiing. And if you play long enough in avalanche terrain, you will inevitably trigger an avalanche. And this picture is Shannon walking on the debris of an avalanche that's triggered. And I want to share, or she wanted to mention the human factor within this. So what goes into our decisions and how humans kind of end up in these. And thankfully, no one was injured or buried or caught in this avalanche. And we kind of like to term those as like free lessons, because often not a lot of lessons from avalanches and snowpack are free. Sometimes there's a cost. So it's actually really great when we can have an experience that's free and there's nothing that came from it. This is the avalanche that was triggered. And let's see. Upper red dot is where the avalanche was initiated, and the lower dot is where she traversed off the slope. This was a wet loose that ran for over 1,000 feet, and the debris was 4 to 5 feet deep, which is like this, basically, and covered the size of 2 football fields. And the key things to know are that super familiar with the area, and they had skied the slope in previous years. And they had skied other aspects and found light snow, light powder. And so that was kind of like what the perspective they were taking into skiing this south-facing slope. And the wind had affected the snow closer to the ridge and created variable skiing conditions. Just above where they triggered this avalanche, the snow changed from firm into heavy top of boot powder. And that is a clear sign like, oh, the snow has changed dramatically than what I was expecting. And she kept skiing, but knew that the snow felt heavy, and heavy means wet in the springtime on the south facing slope. Her partners were off that big slope and under a rock watching her. And one radioed that snow was moving, and she looked behind her and saw that the wave of snow was rushing at her and was able to accelerate and traverse off the slope. The slide was, even though it was only a few inches deep at the crown or at the top of the avalanche, could have buried, injured, or killed someone. So again, this was a free lesson. Nothing bad happened this day, but the human bias we'll talk about made a lot of, or added up to a lot of different things that put her in that situation. So human bias is really important. That's what we mean when we talk about the human factor. Human bias, patterns and beliefs and shortcuts, they don't always serve us in the mountains. So other things that can impact the human factor: are we feeling tired? Are we hungry or cold? Are we feeling super stoked and fired up? Is the snow great? Has it just snowed after weeks of no snow? Those are all important things to think about, how your mentality when you're approaching avalanche terrain, and how malleable you are. Are you willing to change your plans? Other things to think about: familiarity bias. Have you been up there before? Has nothing bad ever happened? Seeing other people do it, is someone else doing it? Kind of like that wanting to participate, maybe jealousy, seeing someone else get great turns, you want to go do that too. Are you feeling impatient? Did you pay a lot of money for this trip? Or only have, it's your weekends, you only have 1 or 2 days to ski, and you really wanted to go ski this specific line? And, or this feeling of the skiing is really good, the snow is really good, and it hasn't slid yet. Or perhaps you triggered a small slide and you were able to get out of it. All of these things can influence people to make bad decisions. So some things that we see, factors that influence accidents, not only avalanche accidents, but also general accidents as well as bad outcomes. And for one, that's lack of preparedness. So people that don't even have avalanche gear or do not have the training to use it. Again, that goes into just not being prepared to enact a rescue, as well as poor group communication and planning. What are some other things, patterns that we see? Not being aware of the hazard or the severity of the hazard. Often people did not check the avalanche forecast before going out, or they missed some obvious signs of instability. And honestly, I think a lot of people underestimate the consequences of an avalanche. If you've never been caught in one before, it's just really challenging to wrap that idea around your head of what does it mean to have a season-ending injury, or even to just lose some really expensive piece of gear beyond death. I mean, these are topics that are hard to wrap our mind around, and it's way easier to wrap our mind around missing out on seeing a cool line, or feeling like you wasted your day because you had to turn around and it was your one day off. Like, those are very tangible things we can think about versus having a season-ending injury if you've never had one before. So underestimating consequences of an avalanche is a big one. Other things that can impact it: failure to recognize avalanche terrain and act accordingly. Increased exposure to avalanche hazards. So this can occur when people are traveling uphill and maybe choosing a uphill route that exposed them to a lot of hazard for a long period of time. Another important thing to note is having multiple people on a slope at the same time. If you're choosing to do that, you want to be pretty darn sure that you have made correct choices with your terrain and snowpack assessment, because if multiple people are exposed, That's all of your rescuers you have if something bad were to go wrong. And then, again, it's so important that we list it twice, overestimating your ability to manage the hazard of an avalanche. So what can we do to avoid being part of this process? We want to stack the deck and have a process to manage risk. So this is a great picture from Avalanche Canada that includes a lot of the things we talked about and helps you kind of have a step-by-step process and checklist so that you can avoid being part of that statistic. But it's important to get the forecast, plan your trip, plan what terrain you want to travel in, make sure your gear is working properly, go out in the field and verify, are those conditions what you saw in the forecast? Use those good and safe travel habits, and then evaluate slopes before you ski them. And then it's important to reflect back on your day. Do you think that you made good choices, or did you just get lucky that day? So these are all the components listed out for your pre-trip process. Checking the forecast and having a plan, checking your gear. And this is what our avalanche forecast looks like currently. It is on mtavalanche.org, and it will have the different ranges broken up with the avalanche hazard listed out. Within it, it'll tell you like what is the exact problem that we're seeing, and how will the weather change these conditions, and then what travel practices we should use. And I'm correcting myself, mtavalanche.com is where you find the forecast. So before you go, you want to have a plan. It's not a great idea to just show up at a trailhead with no idea of what your plan was for the day. Making a plan when you're warm and dry, drinking your cup of coffee in the morning, helps you stick to it better, set those boundaries, and then be malleable in changing that if conditions warrant it. So where are we going based on conditions? What's our group size? Who's in our group? How much experience do they have, and what's our hazard? A great way to make a trip plan is by using a lot of resources. There's a lot of mapping resources out there. These days, there's tons of things, Gaia, CalTopo, Onyx, FatMap, and a lot of these different resources give you something called slope angle shading, which gives you different slope angles that are marked with these colors. So the darker the color, the steeper the slope. So it helps you plan your route out. And if your route involves not traveling in avalanche terrain, super key to use this. Yeah, so if you're trying to avoid avalanche terrain, can you do that in practice where you want to go? The important thing to note with maps is that they are fallible. And so it's really important to make in the field observations about is what my map showed me actually avalanche terrain? Am I less than 30 degrees? And then make those observations in the field to double check, because maps can make mistakes. And we will give you ways to do that during your course. All right, backcountry gear. What gear do we need? What are the essentials? So the 3 most essential pieces of gear that you need to have is a beacon, shovel, and a probe. If you do not own those things, we have extras. Definitely email Shannon if you would like to borrow some of that, just so she has it. But we are happy to lend you our gear. And if you are going to be recreating in the backcountry or even skiing the ridge at Bridger Bowl, you need to have a beacon, and you really should have all 3 of those things. But those are really just the bare minimum. That will help you perform a rescue. But what happens if you perform a successful rescue? What happens after? What are some of the things that you need to be able to call for help, stay put and stay warm until help arrives? What if you have to spend an unplanned night out? Do you have enough warm layers? Do you have things to construct an emergency shelter? Are you able to make a rescue sled even if you aren't able to get outside help? So these are all considerations to make with what you're carrying with you. But developing a system is really the most important thing. Bring what makes sense to you and what your goals are in the backcountry. So these are some pictures of all the gear. I think this was part of Alexis's presentation. She had all her gear she brings with her in the backcountry, as well as this pre-trip plan, which is really great to make sure that you don't get halfway to the trailhead and realize that you forgot your skins or you forgot to put new batteries in your beacon. So all these things are really key. Developing a system. Radios are also really nice, especially if you are a motorized user. And before you go to the trailhead, you want to confirm that all your partners have all the essential gear, and then make sure to do a trailhead check to make sure that their gear is working. And we will run through a daily beacon check with you in the course. We'll briefly mention using good travel habits. So safe travel practices are the foundation, or like foundational within recognizing avalanche terrain. And making sure that we give ourselves a margin for error. Even our field observations can be fallible. And you'll find that we'll have a lot of you measure a slope with an inclinometer, and often people get a lot of different answers. And so if you are towing the line and you have a very reactive avalanche problem, it's best to give yourself more margin and stay even further back than you might think. It's adding a little bit to that 29, 30 degree relationship is important if you're really concerned about avalanches that day. Are you protecting your group from an avalanche with good habits? So this goes back to our exposure and vulnerability. Using good travel practices involve traveling one at a time. Like I mentioned, if everyone in your group gets buried in an avalanche, there's no one to perform rescue. And recently we've seen this statistic get higher, but more and more avalanche accidents are occurring with multiple people getting caught at the same time. And generally that can be a result of using improper travel practices. So, and we can't teach you good habits in a lecture in a day, and you can't learn them in a day. So it's really important to practice them. And you can even practice them on terrain that isn't avalanche terrain, but we will go over more of those in the course as well. I'll quickly mention what red flags are. Red flags are recognizing unstable conditions. These are surefire ways for you to see that the snowpack is unstable and maybe it's time to change your travel plan. So red flags are recent avalanches, cracking, collapsing, or woofing. Woofing is the audible sound of a weak layer collapsing underneath you. Often you'll see this occur on slopes that are not steep enough to slide, but it's a great representation of how you can still have that slab and weak layer present on slopes less than 30 degrees. And understanding that there just wasn't enough momentum to get that snow to move downhill. But that's basically, very simply, an avalanche that happened beneath your feet that just wasn't steep enough to slide. A lot of recent snow or rain hitting hard on that liquid water in the snowpack destabilizes it really, really quickly. So that's a red flag for sure. Wind-blown snow. If you see this happening, that is a red flag. Wind is transporting snow and stability is decreasing. Rapid thaw, kind of like we talked about with that avalanche accident or incident example. Rapid thaw was a result of that. These are kind of the pinwheels or cinnamon rolls that you'll see. And another part of that too, a really important red flag, arguably the most important, is recent avalanches. So if you go out in the mountains and you see a recent avalanche, it's a great time for you to reevaluate your plan and see, does that make sense with what you expected? Should you dial back your terrain choices? Because that is as in your face as it gets in terms of instability. There's a recent avalanche. So when you see signs of instability, it is time to dial it back and reduce your exposure. So we did talk a little bit about pits. The thing with snow pits is that, and snow pit tests is, I think it is really great for you all to start understanding that digging in the snow is really important because it helps you see, do we have that recipe for a slab avalanche? Do we have a strong, hard layer over a weaker layer? In practice though, performing a snow pit test accurately takes a lot of practice and a lot of time. And we talk about them more so because the GNFAC uses snow pits a lot to demonstrate instability and to provide you information. So we just want you all to kind of have an understanding of why are we digging snow pits. Often the Avalanche Center will tell you to dig. So we want you to understand what should you be looking for. And really our hope too is that you all feel empowered after the course to submit observations to the GNFAC. We do not care if you know the right terminology or scientific verbiage or anything like that. You telling us that it was way windier than the forecast told you it was going to be is really important. And we have a vast area that we forecast for, and there's only 4 forecasters and myself around to do that. And so having recreators like yourselves in the mountains giving us observations is super, super useful for us in understanding what avalanche problems are happening in all the different zones. So please submit observations. It's really easy to do on our website. You can also just email mtavalanche.com. There's a button on the website you can click, or you can even phone in. We have a phone line. You can leave us just a voice recording there too. So the goal in reflecting on our day is to ride another day. The goal is to come home safely. Managing our risk with that goal in mind is really key. And it is easier to stay out of trouble than get in trouble. Accident prevention is key. When we venture into the winter backcountry, we are venturing into a high consequence environment. Just because, like, avalanches are why we're here, but there's a lot of things that can emphasize and make outcomes of accidents in the backcountry worse, no matter if an avalanche is involved. Falling and breaking your leg 6 miles from the trailhead on a 12-degree day is much, much different, and consequences can be much, much worse than the same leg break on a 70-degree summer day with good weather. Cold temps, limited daylight, bad weather, and limited access all add consequences to accidents. In addition to fatalities, we have several major avalanche incidents each year where people are caught and injured. As you can see, avalanches affect all user groups. I think that historically there's been an idea that perhaps motorized users are caught in more avalanches, and like honestly looking at this data right here, that's not the case at all. It's pretty similar, that as close as it is to skiers too. So that's why it's so important that all user groups understand why they need to know about avalanches and how to keep themselves safe. And anyone that goes into the backcountry or even lives in a snowy winter environment needs to be aware and prepared. We will talk about avalanche rescue in the course. We'll spend the second half of the day going over it. In this area, usually people who are killed in avalanches will die of 2 different things. They will die of hypoxia or lack of oxygen. And here, 50% of people will die of trauma. And that's because we have a lot of things that can maximize the consequences of an avalanche if you were to hit them being buried in one. Hypothermia makes up a tiny percentage, but it's really trauma and hypoxia. How long does it take for someone to die if they are buried in an avalanche? Less than half of full burial survive, and the deeper you are buried, the less likely you are to survive. And after 15 minutes of burial, more than half of completely buried subjects are dead. And survival rates after this drop significantly from here, with the odds getting worse over time. And there are some instances it is possible to survive being buried under snow for a long time if you have an air pocket, but it is very unlikely. And this curve demonstrates why time is of the essence. Being well practiced with performing avalanche rescue is so key. And this data here really shows us why we need to get to an airway as soon as possible. So what to do if you're caught in an avalanche? If you have an airbag, deploy it. You should ditch your skis and your poles. This is why we always, if you use tech toes within a ski binding, you want to make sure that you are not locked because your skis will come off. If you have skis and poles, those are things that will drag you deeper in an avalanche. And you want to be able to be as close to the surface as possible, which is why an airbag is really important if you have one. You want to swim and fight for your life and try to create an air pocket. And stay calm because you want to hope that your partners are well practiced and can come get you because that's who you're relying on at that point. Quickly, stages of companion rescue. You want to make sure that the scene is safe. You don't want to put any other rescuers in harm's way. And having some form of leadership or incident commander is really key to perform an efficient rescue. And that doesn't have to be as formal as it sounds. I mean, often within a group of travelers, there will already be kind of a designated leader, the person with the most experience. And so having someone there to make sure that everyone's in search mode is really key. And maybe if you have a ton of resources, someone's calling for search and rescue. If you have to search, you need to find your lowest point with your beacon, the lowest point where someone is buried. You need a probe for them to pinpoint exactly where you're supposed to start shoveling, and then you shovel like your friend's life depends on it, because it does. And shoveling is the most exhausting part of avalanche rescue. And then after that, it's really helpful to have some first aid skills and have a plan for evacuation. The stages of rescue involve initially watching. This is why it's so important to watch your partners when they ski, because if something were to happen, you want to have a point last seen. You want to know exactly where you last saw them, because if an avalanche takes out a path, you want to be able to go down to that point last seen, and because you can skip that whole start if they were halfway down. So watching your partners, making sure everyone in your group is ready and transitioned before you descend is really important. If you do not have a signal initially, you zigzag the path and you find that signal. Our beacons have a pretty big range, so thankfully we don't have to cover the path with a ton of depth if we don't have a signal. Usually beacons will have a 60 or 70 meter range. So making sure to be thorough though, zigzagging the path is really key. Here's the spacing, 30 meters between. Once you have a signal, you follow those numbers and arrows, and that is your core search. And that is going to lead you in close to that lowest point. And then once you get within 10 meters or so, it's time to get out of your mode of travel and get really close to the surface and find do your find search and find that exact lowest point. This is really slow. Our beacons are super smart, but they can't work that fast. And so we want to be thorough. And I think it's really key to double check, because having that lowest point is your lifeline. That's where you start probing. And then you can see from here, they are going back, double checking 2.6 is their lowest point there. We kind of use like an addition symbol to move up and down to the side. And this is a lot of different icons. And so this will make it so much more sense when you're in the field and you have an instructor demonstrating it right in front of you. And then probing. This is how you identify where to start digging. It's super important that you're able to get a probe strike. And if you do not get a probe strike on your first attempt, being systematic with your probing is really important. We'll go over kind of what that looks like. Here's an example here. And probing perpendicular to the snow surface is also really important. Shoveling goals, reaching the airway as soon as possible, creating a workable platform. And any avalanche can quickly become an emergency, so we want to prepare you for that. Again, it's easier to stay out than get out. Accident prevention is key. Ideally, you never have to perform this, but it's super important that we practice if we're choosing to venture into a winter backcountry environment. Goal of our field days are to practice. We're going to be practicing all these skills. We will spend, again, last half the day practicing rescue, getting you feeling like you at least understand your gear and are able to then go practice more. And we have beacon parks all over. MSU, I believe, has a beacon park. We just set up the beacon park in Story Mill Park. Bridger Bowl has a beacon park. I'm pretty sure Big Sky has a beacon park. So continue to practice, practicing once. I hope that you come away from this field day this weekend understanding just how much more you should practice with your beacon and practice rescue. We also offer companion rescue clinics. If you're feeling really psyched, you want to get your group of partners that you go backcountry skiing or riding with together, get them all together, participate in one of our companion rescue clinics, dial in your rescue, and get more experience. All right, I just dumped a ton of information at you. And I want to see, does anyone have questions? Again, you can also email friendsofgnfac@gmail.com with questions, ask your instructors this weekend. But anything else anyone wants to ask before I say goodbye, and look forward to having you all on our course this weekend. Doesn't look like it, so feel free to stay if you have more questions, but you're welcome to take off. Thanks so much for tuning in, and yeah, really appreciate your attention, and keep asking questions. Come with questions with the course. We're excited to see you.
No.